What if everything you thought you knew about Archie Harrison was a lie? What if the world celebrated a baby that, in reality, may have never existed the way we were told? That's the question no one dared to ask out loud for 6 long years, until now. After years of whispers, hushed conversations in palace corridors, and secrecy that rivaled any Hollywood blockbuster, the nanny who was supposed to care for Archie has finally come forward. And what she revealed is nothing short of shocking. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine stepping into one of the most high-profile households in the world, expecting to meet a newborn, the latest addition to the British royal family. Instead, you find a house full of smiles, cameras, staged appearances, and yet, no baby. Not a single sign that someone had recently given birth. How could this be? You might think this is the start of a mystery novel, but this is reality, or, more accurately, what someone dared to let the world see as reality. The nanny in question had been brought in weeks after Archie's supposed birth, under a veil of urgency and secrecy that immediately set off alarms. She expected to care for a tiny infant, to rock a cradle, to soothe late-night cries. Instead, she entered a household that seemed almost theatrical in its preparation for a child she would never meet in a normal way. She recalls asking for photos, hospital records, anything that would confirm the child's arrival, and was met with silence. She never saw Archie in the hospital. She never witnessed Meghan in the immediate aftermath of childbirth. Nothing matched what the public had been shown. This revelation alone would make headlines. But the story digs even deeper. Consider the timing. The public announcement of Archie's birth, the careful orchestrations for photographers, the media appearances, the baby bump photos, and the carefully curated Instagram posts. All of it designed to convince the world that Meghan had delivered a healthy child. And yet, behind closed doors, the nanny saw a completely different picture. Or, perhaps more accurately, no picture at all. The inconsistencies were glaring, yet no one dared speak. Why is this important now? Because after 6 years of silence, the nanny has broken her oath of secrecy. She's willing to put herself on the line to tell the world what she saw. And her account paints a disturbing portrait, not just of alleged deception, but of the lengths some will go to control a narrative, manipulate public perception, and maintain an image at all costs. This isn't just a story about a baby. It's about trust, power, influence, and what happens when truth is buried under layers of performance. You might be asking, why did it take 6 years for her to speak out? Why now? The answer lies in fear, loyalty, and the unique pressures of working within one of the most scrutinized households in the world. The palace is a place of privilege, yes, but also a place of rules. Rules that enforce silence, obedience, and discretion. Any misstep could mean dismissal, blacklisting, or worse. For years, staff who suspected inconsistencies were too intimidated to voice them. But the nanny watched and waited, silently piecing together the puzzle. And now, the full picture is emerging, piece by piece. Let's take a moment to understand the magnitude of her claim. The British royal family is one of the most photographed, documented, and observed institutions in the world. A pregnancy, a birth, a newborn. These are public events, covered by hundreds of journalists, thousands of photographers, and millions of viewers. For someone to allege that none of this was as it seemed is extraordinary. But extraordinary claims demand extraordinary attention and extraordinary evidence. The nanny's account begins with her arrival at the palace, summoned under urgent circumstances. She remembers the confusion, the secrecy, the atmosphere that felt more like a controlled production than a home preparing for a baby. "I was told to come immediately," she said. And when I arrived, everything seemed staged. There were toys, nursery furniture, and staff bustling about, but no baby. The shock alone was enough to freeze her in place. Imagine walking into a house expecting a crying infant and instead seeing an empty nursery, staff tiptoeing around as if performing a choreographed routine. Her story doesn't stop at observation. She recalls asking to see hospital photos, to verify the birth, to at least have a small reassurance that she wasn't imagining it all. And the silence that met her question was deafening. She says she never saw Archie in any real hospital setting, nor did she witness Meghan in the typical postpartum state. No swollen ankles, no exhausted but joyful mother, no baby scent that fills a room. These are small but critical details, signs any mother and infant would naturally exhibit. Their absence raised immediate concerns for her. As she spent weeks in the household, the nanny began to notice patterns that further fueled her suspicions. Public appearances were meticulously choreographed. Baby Archie was rarely, if ever, seen in unscripted moments. Photos seemed staged, angles carefully chosen. Staff behavior suggested that something was being hidden, but fear and loyalty prevented them from speaking out. The nanny, however, was determined to observe, remember, and eventually report. She pieced together what she saw with what the world had been shown, and the discrepancies were undeniable. But let's pause and consider the emotional weight here. What does it mean for a nanny to step forward after 6 years? This isn't just an act of whistleblowing, it's a gamble. Speaking against a figure like Meghan Markle and the royal institution invites intense scrutiny, public backlash, and potential legal threats. Yet, she felt compelled. Why? Because the truth, in her eyes, mattered more than fear. She had witnessed events, or non-events, that contradicted the narrative presented to millions. And for those who value honesty, credibility, and integrity, silence was no longer an option. Now, imagine being in her shoes. Every day, you walk through a palace, tasked with caring for someone who may not exist in the way the world believes. You see the props, the staged routines, and the public facades. You know that any statement you make could have enormous consequences. Yet the questions swirl in your mind. Why stage a pregnancy? Why manipulate public perception so completely? Who benefits, and at what cost to the truth? These are questions that will drive this story forward, revealing layers of deception, strategy, and human psychology that most people never consider. The nanny's revelations don't merely hint at deception. They suggest a carefully orchestrated performance, one that involved timing, appearances, and control over information. From public announcements to media coverage, everything was designed to shape perception. And yet, the insider's view, the one hidden from public scrutiny, reveals the cracks. It exposes contradictions, missing evidence, and moments that simply don't add up. For the first time, the world has a glimpse of what it's like behind the velvet curtains, beyond the smiling cameras, and outside the public narratives carefully constructed by those in power. By now, you're probably asking, does this mean Archie never existed? That's a question the nanny can't definitively answer in the way tabloids suggest, but her observations create a context that raises serious doubts. The point isn't just whether a child exists. It's about the manipulation of truth and the curated reality presented to the world. And in the palace, where image and narrative reign supreme, perception often becomes reality. So why now? Why reveal this story after 6 years of silence? It's simple. Timing, courage, and accumulated evidence. The nanny waited, watching, piecing together what she could without jeopardizing her safety. She observed patterns, questioned inconsistencies, and gathered insights that only someone in her position could know. And now, with the world's attention constantly on the royal family, she felt the moment was right to speak, to finally illuminate the truth behind the headlines. But what makes this story truly shocking isn't just the absence of a baby. It's the implications. It's the realization that everything we thought we knew, the photos, the announcements, the media coverage, may have been carefully orchestrated theater. It's about deception on a scale few can imagine, the impact on public trust, and the lengths people will go to control narrative. And as the nanny begins to share her account, we'll uncover moments that are both baffling and heartbreaking, each one raising more questions than answers. By the end of this story, you'll see the palace in a completely new light. You'll question what is real, what is staged, and what lies behind the curtains of privilege and power. You'll wonder how such an elaborate charade could be maintained for years without someone breaking the silence, until now. And perhaps most importantly, you'll be left with a lingering question that the nanny herself posed. If one person saw this and had the courage to speak, how many others knew and stayed silent? What would you do if you received a call in the dead of night asking you to join one of the most secretive households in the world? For the nanny at the center of this story, it was a phone call that would change her life forever. She had been working in childcare for years, caring for the children of high-profile families, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her in the home of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. The request was urgent, mysterious, and wrapped in layers of secrecy. "Can you start immediately?" the voice asked. There was no preamble, no small talk. The tone was direct, commanding, and hinted at urgency. The nanny remembers the chill that ran down her spine. Most calls like this came with detailed explanations, trial periods, or at least some context. But this one was different. Weeks had passed since Archie Harrison's birth announcement, a highly publicized event celebrated by the world. And yet, no one had told her she was even being considered. Suddenly, she was being summoned into a situation that felt more like a spy thriller than a job. She arrived at the palace with anticipation, her mind racing with questions. Would she be taking care of a newborn? Were there special medical instructions? How had they heard of her? And most importantly, why now? Upon arrival, she was greeted by a household buzzing with activity. But something felt off. There were smiles, nods, and a palpable sense of urgency, yet no baby in sight. The nursery, immaculate and prepared for use, sat empty, almost like a stage set waiting for its actors. The first few hours were a blur of introductions. Staff members, all impeccably dressed and polite, gave her cursory explanations. She was shown around, briefed on schedules, and reminded of her duties. But the most crucial detail, the child, was conspicuously absent. The nanny recalls feeling a knot tighten in her stomach. She had expected a tiny human to hold, to feed, to soothe. Instead, she found a household focused on appearances, on managing perceptions, on controlling information. Days turned into weeks, and the nanny began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. Every request she made, from photos to hospital records, was met with vague answers or outright silence. She asked to see the baby, to verify birth details, and was assured everything was under control. But the lack of evidence was troubling. She wondered if she was imagining things, questioning her own judgment. How could a palace so meticulously managed omit something so fundamental as a newborn? She wasn't alone in noticing the oddities. Other staff members whispered in hushed tones, careful not to draw attention. Some had suspicions of their own, but were too fearful to voice them. The nanny, however, felt compelled to observe, to take note, and to remain vigilant. She began to keep a mental record of every inconsistency, every unexplained delay, and every staged appearance. What she documented would later become a crucial piece of the puzzle. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during a routine introduction to the nursery. She expected the smell of a newborn, the subtle cries, the soft weight of a baby in her arms. None of it was present. Toys were arranged as if ready for play. A bassinet stood in the corner, and there were blankets folded neatly, but no child. The absence of a baby, in a room designed entirely around one, sent a shiver down her spine. She confronted herself with the question that would haunt her for weeks. Could this really be real? Was the baby hidden? Was there some medical reason she hadn't been informed? Or, as the whispers suggested, was something more deliberate happening? The staff's behavior was meticulous, polite, yet distant. Every glance, every gesture seemed calculated. The nanny began to realize she was not just a caretaker. She was a witness to something larger, something orchestrated with precision. The next moment of unease arrived when she asked about hospital photos. Surely, she thought, there must be official documentation, images, any proof of Archie's existence. The response was a careful avoidance of her question. She received smiles, vague explanations, and assurances that everything was in order, but nothing concrete. The silence was deafening. This was not the behavior of a household managing a typical newborn. Something was off, and it was glaringly obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Over time, she noticed the elaborate staging for public appearances. Every event, every photograph, every media moment seemed choreographed. Baby Archie was always presented in the right light, with the perfect angle, the perfect timing. Behind the scenes, however, the nanny saw the absence of normalcy. There were no unscripted moments, no spontaneous interactions, no everyday chaos that a real infant brings. She began to question the authenticity of every public appearance. Despite her growing unease, she continued her duties with professionalism. She fed, cleaned, and managed schedules, all while keeping a careful eye on the contradictions around her. The tension was palpable. Every interaction with Meghan felt calculated, every instruction precise. The nanny couldn't shake the feeling that she had been brought in not merely to care for a child, but to be part of a carefully controlled narrative. Her suspicions grew when she noticed inconsistencies in the staff stories. Some mentioned seeing the baby at odd hours. Others insisted they had never been allowed near him. The conflicting accounts created confusion, but also reinforced her sense that the truth was being manipulated. The nanny began to document these discrepancies, building a mental timeline of events that didn't align with the public record. Weeks into her assignment, the pressure became almost unbearable. She felt isolated, surrounded by a team that was tight-lipped and wary. She began asking more pointed questions, carefully, subtly, to gauge reactions. The responses were always controlled, polite, and evasive. It was clear that her role extended beyond ordinary childcare. She was a witness, an observer, a silent recorder of anomalies. One evening, she recalls, a senior staff member quietly pulled her aside. "Not everything you see is what it seems," they whispered. "Some things are arranged." The gravity of the statement struck her. It confirmed her suspicions that something larger, more deliberate, was at play, and it was only the beginning. The layers of secrecy she had begun to uncover were far deeper than she could have imagined, and they would challenge everything she thought she knew about this household. Her mind raced with questions. Why go to such lengths to fabricate or manipulate a story about a newborn? Who was orchestrating these events, and to what end? Could the public truly believe the image being presented? The nanny realized that she was at the center of a story that went far beyond typical palace intrigue. She was witnessing a high-stakes performance, a reality crafted with precision, and she was one of the few people who could see the discrepancies. As she navigated her duties, she became increasingly aware of the duality of life in the household, the public facade versus the private reality. Every staged smile, every orchestrated moment, every carefully framed photograph contrasted sharply with the emptiness she observed behind closed doors. The tension was electric, the secrecy suffocating, and the implications profound. The nanny knew she had to be careful. Speaking out prematurely could jeopardize her career, her safety, and her credibility. But remaining silent was no longer an option in her mind. She had seen enough inconsistencies to know that something was amiss. She began to piece together the timeline, documenting events in her memory, noting the subtle behaviors that revealed the orchestrated nature of this household. And yet, despite her observations, she had no way of knowing the full extent of the deception, or what revelations were waiting for her in the weeks to come. She had taken the first step into a world where appearances and reality were dangerously misaligned. Every day brought new contradictions, more evidence that the narrative presented to the public might not match the truth she was witnessing firsthand. The initial call, the sudden summons to the palace, seemed innocuous at first. But in hindsight, the nanny recognizes it as the opening chapter of a story that would shake public perception and reveal truths no one expected. Her arrival marked the beginning of 6 years of secrecy, observation, and questions that demanded answers. And as the days unfolded, she realized that what she was seeing was not ordinary. It was something far more complex, calculated, and extraordinary than anyone could have anticipated. Walking into a palace for the first time is an experience few people ever get to have. For the nanny, it was a mixture of awe, nerves, and an unsettling sense of anticipation. She had cared for children in high-profile households before, but nothing could have prepared her for the carefully curated, almost theatrical world of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. The moment she stepped through the gilded doors, she felt the weight of secrecy pressing down on her, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, guarding a story no one was meant to hear. The arrival was orchestrated with precision. Staff members greeted her politely, but with a level of formality that was unusual, even by royal standards. It wasn't just a matter of etiquette. It felt like she had walked onto a stage set where every movement, every word, and every glance was choreographed. She noticed the subtle glances exchanged between staff, the small nods of acknowledgement that seemed to communicate messages she wasn't meant to understand. In that moment, she realized that entering this household meant entering a bubble, an entirely controlled environment where reality and performance existed side by side. Her first hours were a whirlwind of introductions. She met the butler, the house manager, and other staff, each one giving brief instructions, and outlining her responsibilities. The nursery was shown to her, immaculate and fully equipped, every detail designed to convey readiness for a newborn. There were soft blankets, stuffed toys neatly arranged, and an empty bassinet waiting in the corner. Yet, there was no baby. The absence was jarring, almost surreal. She had expected to be greeted by a tiny bundle of life, the smell of a newborn filling the air, and instead, she found a room frozen in time, ready for something that may not have existed in the way the public had been told. Questions swirled in her mind. Where was Archie? How could a baby be announced publicly and yet be completely absent from the private household? She asked herself if there was some explanation she didn't know, a hospital visit, a temporary placement, or perhaps a precaution she hadn't been briefed on. But the staff's careful, evasive responses suggested something far more deliberate. Every answer was polite yet opaque, designed to placate her curiosity without revealing any concrete information. The nanny recalls the first time she saw Meghan in person. The Duchess's presence was commanding, poised, and deliberate. Every gesture seemed calculated, every word measured. There was warmth, yes, but also a subtle distance, a barrier that separated the public persona from the private reality. Meghan welcomed her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a cordiality that felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. The nanny couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a performance, and she was part of the audience, whether she liked it or not. As days turned into weeks, the peculiarities of palace life became increasingly apparent. The nanny observed staff routines, noting how meticulously every detail was managed. Meals were timed, schedules rigidly enforced, and every appearance by Meghan carefully orchestrated. Even the moments that should have felt casual, conversations, interactions, playful gestures, were laced with intentionality. There was a constant awareness that cameras or onlookers could be nearby, even if they weren't physically present. This was a household where perception was as important, if not more so, than reality. One of the first moments that truly unsettled her occurred during a routine check of the nursery. She expected small details that confirmed a baby's presence: a slightly damp diaper, the scent of infant powder, the soft warmth of tiny blankets used. Instead, the room remained pristine, almost eerily so. It was as if the nursery existed solely for appearances, a stage set for a performance, rather than a space lived in by a newborn. The nanny began to question the narrative she had been handed and the story that the world had been told. Her suspicions deepened when she noticed the behavior of the other staff members. They moved with caution, whispering in corners, avoiding eye contact when sensitive topics were mentioned. It became clear that there was a culture of silence and fear, a silent agreement to uphold appearances no matter the personal cost. Some staff seemed uncomfortable, others indifferent, but all were united in maintaining the facade. The nanny realized she had stepped into a world where loyalty and discretion were enforced with subtle, yet unmistakable pressure. The public's perception of Archie's birth couldn't have been more different from what the nanny observed behind closed doors. Media outlets had celebrated the arrival of the royal baby, broadcasting images and videos of a smiling Meghan, carefully posed in hospital gowns, and photographs that appeared to show a content newborn. Yet, in the private household, the narrative didn't align. She never witnessed the infant in the ways a nanny normally would. Feeding times, midnight cries, the small joys and challenges of caring for a newborn. Instead, what she encountered were staged routines, props, and carefully timed appearances that suggested an illusion rather than reality. It wasn't just the absence of a baby that struck her. It was the consistency of the discrepancies. Every detail, from hospital photos to public appearances, seemed to be carefully controlled, leaving little room for spontaneity or verification. The nanny began to feel like she was inside a bubble, a controlled environment designed to perpetuate a narrative rather than reveal the truth. And as she spent more time there, she noticed subtle cues, small hints, incongruities, and contradictions that suggested a deliberate orchestration of events. The sense of isolation was profound. Unlike other high-profile households she had worked in, there was a constant awareness that every movement could be monitored, every question scrutinized. Even casual conversations carried weight, as if the wrong word could unravel the carefully constructed narrative. She realized that her role extended beyond traditional childcare. She had become an observer, a silent witness to something larger than herself. Despite the unease, the nanny continued to fulfill her duties. She maintained professionalism, attended to the household's needs, and observed meticulously, documenting in her mind every inconsistency. She began to notice the choreography of daily life. The way Meghan's schedule was arranged around public appearances, the timing of photo ops, and the absence of authentic interactions that would normally accompany a newborn in the home. Each day added another layer to her understanding of the household's unusual dynamics. One evening, during a quiet moment in the nursery, the nanny reflected on the strange duality she was witnessing. Publicly, the household appeared joyous, celebrating a new life. Privately, there was a sense of performance, a meticulous orchestration of appearances, and a conspicuous absence of the very child everyone claimed to be present. She felt a mix of awe, confusion, and growing suspicion. What was real? What was staged? And how deep did the orchestrated illusion go? The turning point came when a senior staff member, noticing her concern, quietly warned her not to question appearances too closely. "Things are not always as they seem," they whispered. It was the first confirmation that her instincts were correct, that behind the polished smiles and staged routines, there was a hidden reality the public was never meant to see. The nanny realized she was witnessing a highly curated environment, one where perception was carefully managed and the truth remained deliberately obscured. She began to connect the dots, observing the timing of events, the controlled access to information, and the deliberate staging of public appearances. Each inconsistency became a clue, each omission a puzzle piece in a narrative that had been carefully crafted. She questioned why such lengths were necessary, who was orchestrating the events, and what the ultimate goal might be. The answers were not immediately clear, but the patterns were undeniable. By the end of her first few weeks, the nanny understood that entering the palace was not just about joining a household. It was about stepping into a controlled world, a bubble where reality and performance were intertwined. Every interaction, every observation, and every piece of information was filtered through a lens of secrecy and control. She realized that her role was far more complex than she had anticipated. She was both caretaker and witness, observer and participant in a story that the public would never see firsthand. And just when she began to acclimate to this strange duality, a subtle shift occurred. Small discrepancies she had noted, objects moved, routines altered, staff behavior unusual, started forming a pattern too deliberate to ignore. The narrative of Archie's birth and presence in the household was unraveling in ways that would soon become impossible to ignore. The nanny's initial weeks were merely the prelude to revelations that would shock the world, challenge perceptions, and expose a carefully maintained illusion. Imagine being hired to care for a newborn and discovering, within days, that the baby you were brought in to care for might not even exist. For the nanny, this was not a hypothetical, it was her reality. In the first few weeks at the palace, she quickly realized that nothing about her assignment was ordinary. Every routine, every schedule, every interaction was meticulously designed, but the central element, the infant, was conspicuously absent. The days blurred together in a haze of observation and unease. Each morning, she would walk into the nursery, expecting at least a small sign of life. A blanket that had been used, a toy moved, a scent of powder or baby lotion lingering in the air. But nothing. The room was immaculate, untouched, perfectly staged. It was as if the nursery existed solely for appearances, a set prepared for photographs or public tours rather than actual use. The emptiness gnawed at her, creating a tension she couldn't ignore. She began to ask questions, subtle, careful questions. Who had fed the baby overnight? Where were the diapers kept? Were there any hospital records she could review? The answers were consistently vague. "Everything is under control," one staff member would say. "All routines are followed," another would insist. But when pressed, no one provided concrete evidence. The silence was deafening, and the nanny began to realize that this was more than oversight. It was deliberate. Weeks passed, and the inconsistencies only grew. While the palace was bustling with activity, staff preparing rooms, arranging toys, coordinating schedules, the central expectation of her employment remained unfulfilled. No one asked her to feed the infant. No one showed her photographs that could confirm the child's presence. In fact, she realized, she had never even been allowed near the baby in the way a nanny normally would. It was as though her role was being used to maintain the illusion of care without the reality. The nanny noticed subtle signs that hinted at a carefully constructed performance. Public appearances, she realized, were carefully timed and executed. Baby Archie was always positioned perfectly, photographed at specific angles, often seen for just moments in highly controlled settings. Any unscripted or natural moments, crying, feeding, or fussing, were conspicuously absent. Staff members moved with caution, aware of how these moments could be interpreted by cameras or outsiders. The nanny began to suspect that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a manufactured narrative designed to convince the world that the child existed exactly as presented. The pressure on the staff was palpable. Whispered conversations, careful glances, and unspoken warnings created an atmosphere where deviation from the narrative was not an option. Some staff members appeared uneasy, but fear or loyalty prevented them from speaking openly. The nanny, however, began to recognize patterns. Every gap in routine, every unexplained delay, every absence of evidence contributed to a growing picture of deception. She realized that she was part of a system that carefully controlled what was seen, what was said, and what the public believed. She began to question the public timeline of events. Archie's birth had been announced with great fanfare, accompanied by photographs and media coverage. Yet, the household routines she observed suggested that either the baby was absent for much of the time or that the household deliberately avoided presenting him in ways typical for a newborn. The discrepancies were too significant to ignore, and the nanny began to piece together a timeline that didn't match public reports. The emotional toll was immense. Caring for a child is deeply personal, intimate work. Yet here she was, going through the motions of caregiving without ever interacting with the very child she had been hired to nurture. She described feelings of confusion, frustration, and growing anxiety. It wasn't just professional disorientation, it was a moral and emotional struggle. How could a household present one story to the world while operating in secrecy behind the scenes? How could staff participate in this illusion without question? Rumors and whispers began circulating among staff. Some suggested that the baby might be somewhere else temporarily. Others hinted at staged photos or the use of doubles. The nanny listened carefully, absorbing every detail. Each snippet of information seemed to confirm her observations, that the reality inside the palace was carefully curated and controlled, and that the world's perception was being manipulated with precision. One particularly unsettling moment came during a scheduled baby introduction for new staff. The nanny was led into the nursery, expecting to meet the infant. Instead, she found a room prepared for presentation, blankets neatly folded, toys arranged, and a bassinet standing empty. It was a jarring confirmation of her growing suspicion. The emphasis on presentation rather than interaction made it increasingly clear that the palace was managing appearances above all else. During these weeks, the nanny also observed Meghan's behavior closely. The Duchess appeared composed, poised, and meticulously styled at all times. There were no signs of postpartum exhaustion, no indication of the natural physical or emotional tolls that come with childbirth. It was as if she was performing a role, not living a reality. The nanny began to wonder how much of what she saw was genuine maternal behavior and how much was carefully constructed for public consumption. The tension escalated further when she attempted to request more tangible proof of the baby's existence. Hospital photos, birth records, anything to verify the public narrative. Each request was met with resistance or evasion. Staff would redirect her questions, provide vague reassurances, or simply avoid the topic. The nanny realized that asking these questions, even politely, was walking a fine line. It became apparent that the palace had established a culture where curiosity was tolerated only insofar as it did not disrupt the narrative. In the evenings, she would reflect on what she had observed, piecing together patterns, anomalies, and gaps. She began to keep a mental record of every detail: the timing of public appearances, the orchestrated movements of staff, the absence of authentic interactions. Each day added to the accumulating evidence that the household was functioning more as a stage production than a genuine family environment. And yet, despite all of this, she continued her duties diligently. She cared for the rooms, maintained schedules, and interacted with staff, all while observing quietly. Her role was paradoxical. She was both participant and witness, performing normal childcare responsibilities while documenting the inconsistencies that hinted at a deeper truth. She knew that her observations might one day be crucial, even if she didn't yet fully understand the scope of what she was seeing. The weeks without a baby were the first concrete confirmation of her suspicions. The absence of normal infant cues, feeding schedules, diaper changes, cries, or even casual moments was undeniable. The staged nature of the household's presentation became increasingly apparent, and the nanny realized she had entered an environment where perception was manipulated with deliberate intent. She was witnessing a story carefully crafted to be believable to the outside world, even as the private reality remained obscured. By the end of these initial weeks, the nanny understood that her role extended far beyond ordinary childcare. She had become an observer of a carefully controlled reality, a witness to a narrative that contradicted public perception. Every moment, every observation, every subtle detail contributed to a growing understanding that the story of Archie Harrison's birth and presence in the palace was not as straightforward as it had appeared. But just as she began to piece together these early observations, a revelation would emerge, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the household and the narrative presented to the world. The weeks without a baby were only the beginning, a prelude to the extraordinary discoveries that would follow, and the truth behind the carefully curated public image was about to begin revealing itself in ways she and the world could never have anticipated. Have you ever asked to see proof of something so ordinary, so fundamental, that it should be unquestionable? For most parents, seeing hospital photos, birth records, or even a tiny snapshot is routine. But for the nanny at the center of this story, such proof was always just out of reach. Weeks into her assignment, she realized that the one thing she needed to confirm the existence of Archie Harrison, the hospital photos, simply didn't exist in the way she expected. It began with a simple, professional question. "May I see any photographs from the hospital?" she asked, carefully, politely. She assumed the answer would be a quick, "of course," or at least an explanation of where to find them. Instead, she was met with silence, a subtle shift in demeanor, and polite deflections. One staff member responded, "Everything is fine. The photos are with the PR team." Another suggested, almost dismissively, that the Duchess preferred privacy in those first days. Each answer was vague, carefully constructed to avoid the uncomfortable truth. The lack of hospital photos wasn't just strange, it was impossible to ignore. Every nanny she had worked with in the past, every family she had cared for, had relied on some tangible proof of a child's existence. Birth certificates, hospital images, even fleeting snapshots in the hallway were considered essential. Here, there was nothing. Not a single image, not a scrap of evidence, no visual confirmation that the baby had even been in the palace in those critical first days. It was as if the birth had been an event that only existed in the public eye, carefully documented for appearances, but never verified behind closed doors. Her frustration grew as days passed. Every request for documentation was met with increasingly creative evasions. Staff insisted that everything was under control, that she was simply overthinking matters, or that everything would be revealed in time. But the time never came. No photos, no records, no confirmation. The nursery remained pristine, the routine staged, and the baby, Archie Harrison, remained unseen in any verifiable way. Then came the first whispers. Other staff members, in quiet moments, hinted at the oddity of the situation. Some had been present for the public announcements, but had never seen the infant themselves. Others suggested that perhaps the media had been shown what they were supposed to see, carefully curated images, or even substitutes. These conversations were fleeting and cautious. Fear of repercussions was pervasive. But for the nanny, each whisper added weight to her growing suspicion. The story of Archie's birth might not be entirely what it appeared. The emotional toll was significant. She had expected joy, excitement, and the warmth of caring for a newborn. Instead, She was confronted with an unsettling mix of secrecy, meticulous staging, and the absence of the very child she had been hired to care for. She recalls lying awake at night, questioning her own judgment. Was it possible she had misread the situation? Could she be imagining things? But each day's observations, each staff interaction, and each unanswered question reinforced her belief that something was deliberately hidden. The absence of hospital photos also created professional complications. How could she care for a child she had never seen, with no official documentation to guide her responsibilities? In her previous positions, hospital photos were essential, not just for verification, but to understand feeding patterns, medical needs, and milestones. Here, she had nothing. It was as if she had been asked to care for a ghost. She began to pay closer attention to the staff's behavior. Everyone moved with precision, aware that any misstep could unravel the carefully constructed image. When she brought up the hospital photos, even in passing, conversations would abruptly shift. Staff members would redirect her, emphasize routines, or remind her of her duties. The message was clear. Questions about evidence were unwelcome. There was a pattern of control and redirection, a quiet insistence that appearances must be maintained above all else. One particularly telling moment came when she asked about the photographer who had been present for the official announcement. "Can I see any images from that day?" she inquired. The answer was evasive. "Those images are controlled by our PR team," she was told. "They are being handled professionally." But professional handling didn't explain the absence of any personal verification. No photos to review, no official documentation accessible to staff. It was as if the birth itself existed only in a carefully curated narrative, visible to the world but invisible to those tasked with actual care. The nanny also began to notice the deliberate orchestration of public appearances. Every photograph, every video clip released to the media seemed staged with meticulous care. The infant was always presented in controlled moments, with careful attention to angles, lighting, and timing. Behind closed doors, however, the scenes were starkly different. There was no unscripted interaction, no spontaneous play or fussing. The absence of hospital photos mirrored this larger pattern of controlled presentation. What the public saw was carefully manufactured, while the truth remained hidden. Her frustration, curiosity, and concern coalesced into a determination. She needed to understand the truth. She began to piece together a mental map of timelines, staff behavior, and public appearances. Each missing hospital photo became a clue in a larger puzzle. Each inconsistency another piece of evidence suggesting that the narrative presented to the world was not entirely factual. As she delved deeper, she encountered small contradictions that further heightened her suspicion. Staff schedules didn't align with the supposed newborn routines. Items in the nursery remained untouched despite supposed daily use. Even casual comments from staff hinted at inconsistencies. References to times and events that didn't match the public story. These contradictions were subtle but cumulative, building a pattern of deception she could no longer ignore. The nanny also began to reflect on Meghan's behavior during this period. The Duchess was composed, impeccably styled, and always poised. There were no signs of the physical toll or emotional vulnerability that typically accompanies childbirth. For someone observing closely, this absence of postpartum cues was unusual, almost impossible to overlook. It suggested that the public narrative of a new mother caring for her newborn might have been constructed for appearances rather than reflecting the reality within the household. Each unanswered question, each missing photo, and each careful deflection by staff added weight to a growing realization. The story of Archie Harrison's early days, as presented to the world, did not align with the reality she observed. The missing hospital photos were not just an anomaly. They were a symbol of a larger orchestration, a deliberate manipulation of truth designed to maintain an image of normalcy, joy, and legitimacy. Yet even as these inconsistencies mounted, she remained cautious. Speaking out prematurely could have serious consequences. Legal threats, professional blacklisting, and public backlash were constant concerns. She had to navigate this environment carefully, documenting her observations mentally, noting patterns, and quietly piecing together the narrative behind the curated appearances. And then, one day, a senior staff member, someone with years of experience in the palace, offered a subtle confirmation. In a quiet, almost whispered tone, they remarked, "Not everything you see, or don't see, is exactly what it appears." That single line validated her growing suspicion and marked the first time someone acknowledged that there were deliberate gaps in the story of Archie Harrison's birth. The nanny realized she was on the cusp of understanding something extraordinary, a carefully constructed performance designed to manipulate perception, with the missing hospital photos at its core. By the end of these weeks, the nanny understood a crucial truth. In this household, evidence was carefully controlled, appearances were paramount, and reality was subordinate to narrative. The missing hospital photos were not an oversight. They were part of a deliberate orchestration. And as the days progressed, she would begin uncovering further inconsistencies, contradictions, and subtle clues that would ultimately form a shocking picture, one that would challenge everything the public believed about Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and the story of Archie Harrison. Have you ever wondered what really happens behind the perfectly framed images we see in the media? We scroll through photographs, smile at curated moments, and assume that what we see is exactly what exists. But in the case of Archie Harrison, the nanny quickly realized that public appearances were a carefully orchestrated performance, and the reality behind closed doors was a starkly different story. From the very beginning, it was obvious that every public outing, every photograph, and every media moment was meticulously planned. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's presentation of Archie was flawless, polished, and designed to evoke warmth, love, and authenticity. The Duchess appeared poised, smiling, and composed, effortlessly projecting the image of a devoted new mother. The baby, when glimpsed by the public, was always perfectly positioned, perfectly dressed, and perfectly timed for photographs. But the nanny's insider perspective painted a vastly different picture. During her first weeks, she observed the household preparing for what she soon realized were not just routine care activities, but rehearsals for public consumption. Rooms were staged, outfits carefully selected, and moments timed down to the minute. Staff were acutely aware of the choreography, moving quietly to avoid disrupting the image being curated for the cameras. Every detail was measured, from the angle of a tiny blanket to the placement of a stuffed animal in the bassinet. It was as if the entire household operated like a movie set, with the nanny cast as a silent observer. The contrast between what the public saw and what the nanny experienced behind the scenes was striking. On screen, Archie appeared active, content, and present in Meghan's arms. In reality, the nanny rarely saw him at all, and when she did, it was during brief, highly controlled moments. There were no unscripted cries, no spontaneous interactions, and no ordinary chaos of daily infant care. The absence of natural infant behavior was unsettling and immediately raised questions about the authenticity of the public narrative. One of the first incidents that cemented her suspicions occurred during a high-profile public appearance. Cameras captured Meghan holding Archie, smiling at the press, while reporters shouted questions from a distance. Behind the scenes, the nanny noticed subtle cues, staff whispering instructions, movements perfectly timed, and Meghan herself carefully controlling how the infant was presented. It felt staged, rehearsed, almost like a scene from a film rather than a real-life interaction. The nanny's professional instincts kicked in. Something about this was off. As she settled into her role, she began to document patterns in the timing and presentation of public appearances. Every photograph, every video clip, seemed choreographed to maximize media impact while minimizing unscripted exposure. Baby Archie was presented in ways that reinforced the public image, but never in situations that would reveal the truth behind his early life. She began to notice repeated techniques, the positioning of the baby relative to Meghan, the use of props to obscure natural behaviors, and the orchestration of smiles and gestures to maintain the illusion of authenticity. The nanny also observed the effects on staff. Everyone was hyper-aware of how their actions could affect public perception. A simple mistake, moving an object slightly, stepping into a frame, was avoided at all costs. Staff conversations were careful, limited, and laden with subtle warnings about maintaining the narrative. The nanny understood quickly that she was part of a controlled ecosystem, where reality was subordinate to image, and appearances were paramount. Despite the meticulous presentation, the nanny began to notice cracks in the performance. There were small, unintentional inconsistencies, a toy placed incorrectly, a blanket slightly askew, a fleeting expression on Meghan's face that didn't align with the image being projected. Each anomaly reinforced her suspicion that the household was not functioning like a normal family environment, but rather like a tightly managed production, designed to convince the public that Archie existed exactly as reported. The emotional impact of these observations was profound. Caring for a child involves intimacy, observation, and responsiveness to needs. Yet in this environment, caregiving was intertwined with a performance, and the nanny felt herself caught between professional responsibility and incredulity. She had expected ordinary maternal moments, midnight cries, feeding schedules, and spontaneous play, but found instead an orchestrated routine designed for media consumption. The gap between public appearances and private reality became increasingly impossible to ignore. One particularly striking example occurred during a scheduled photo opportunity. Meghan and Archie were posed for photographs in a garden, with the perfect lighting and backdrop. To the public, it was a heartwarming, genuine moment. To the nanny, however, it was a calculated performance. She noted staff members standing discreetly off camera, whispering instructions, and ensuring that every movement reinforced the desired narrative. The baby's limited interaction, the controlled expressions, and the absence of unscripted behavior all suggested that what the world saw was a carefully manufactured image rather than spontaneous reality. This observation was not isolated. Across multiple appearances, walks, official events, and private tours, the pattern was consistent. Archie was always presented in highly controlled moments, with staff ensuring that everything aligned with the public narrative. The nanny began to understand that she was witnessing a dual reality, one created for the world, polished and perfect, and another hidden behind closed doors, starkly different and carefully managed. The contrast extended to Meghan herself. Publicly, she projected warmth, care, and maternal instinct. Privately, however, the nanny observed a level of precision, distance, and control that was striking. Every gesture was intentional, every interaction measured. The absence of ordinary maternal behavior, those small, intimate cues that a newborn inspires, was noticeable and, over time, impossible to dismiss. It suggested that the Duchess's public image was not entirely aligned with private reality. The implications of these observations were enormous. The nanny realized that the household's approach to public appearances was more than image management. It was a deliberate orchestration designed to shape perception, control narrative, and maintain the illusion of authenticity. The world was being shown exactly what the household wanted it to see, while the private reality remained carefully concealed. This realization added layers of tension and urgency to the nanny's observations. She began to ask herself difficult questions. If public appearances were so meticulously staged, what other elements of Archie's life were being controlled or fabricated? Were there moments the public would never see? Was the narrative of his early days aligned with reality, or had it been constructed entirely to maintain a particular image? Each question deepened the sense of unease and reinforced her growing suspicion that the story presented to the world was only a fraction of the truth. The tension escalated further when she noticed the contrast between staff behavior and public appearances. Behind closed doors, there were whispers, careful instructions, and subtle warnings about maintaining appearances. In public, everything was polished and seamless. This duality, the public image versus private reality, highlighted the extraordinary lengths the household went to control perception. The nanny understood that she had a unique vantage point, witnessing the inner workings of a story carefully curated for mass consumption. By the end of these observations, she realized that public appearances were not merely presentations, they were performances. Every photograph, every smile, every moment was carefully constructed to maintain the narrative of Archie Harrison's presence and well-being. And while the world celebrated these images, the private reality she observed suggested that what was being shown was not entirely truthful. But the most shocking revelations were still ahead. The nanny's weeks of careful observation had laid the groundwork, documenting discrepancies and patterns that pointed to a larger orchestration. And as she continued her role, she would uncover moments that contradicted public perception in ways that no one outside the palace could have imagined. In any high-profile household, There are layers of hierarchy, protocol, and unspoken rules, but the palace took this to an entirely new level. Within weeks of starting her assignment, the nanny noticed a strange pattern. The staff would speak in whispers when discussing anything related to Archie, Meghan, or even the household routines. It wasn't just caution, it was fear. And as she slowly gained trust, she began to hear the stories that nobody dared to tell aloud. The first whispers came almost immediately after her arrival. While performing routine tasks, she overheard subtle conversations in corners, hushed tones that would stop the moment she approached. At first, she assumed it was normal gossip or internal coordination, but it became clear that these were carefully measured exchanges about things staff weren't supposed to talk about publicly. Some were mundane, a comment on a schedule or a minor mishap, but others hinted at inconsistencies that directly contradicted the public narrative of Archie Harrison. Staff members, though polite and professional in front of her, had developed a complex signaling system. A subtle glance, a raised eyebrow, or a carefully placed hand gesture often conveyed more information than words ever could. She realized that beneath the polished surface of obedience and decorum was a network of people quietly aware of a deeper truth, but too fearful to speak openly. It was a delicate balance, loyalty to the household versus the reality she was beginning to perceive. One evening, while helping with laundry in a side corridor, she caught two junior staff members whispering about something they had seen earlier in the day. "Did you notice?" one asked in a hushed tone. The other shook their head, glancing over their shoulder nervously. "It's not what they want anyone to know. Just keep your mouth shut." The nanny froze. For the first time, she realized that she was not merely observing anomalies in routine or timing. The staff themselves were aware that something about Archie's existence, or lack thereof, was being carefully concealed. The tension in the staff quarters was palpable. There was an unspoken understanding that certain topics could never be broached openly. Questions about the baby's whereabouts, medical details, or even the nursery setup were off-limits. Yet, despite the fear, small pieces of information leaked in whispers, fleeting comments, and indirect references. The nanny began to piece together a hidden narrative from these fragments, each one suggesting that the story presented to the public did not fully align with the reality inside the palace. One staff member, a housekeeper with years of experience in high-profile homes, finally confided in her under strict assurance of discretion. "I've seen a lot in my career," the staffer said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. "But this isn't normal. Things are staged. Some of what the world sees, what you hear on the news, it's carefully constructed." The nanny listened intently, realizing that this was confirmation from someone deeply embedded in the palace system. There were deliberate manipulations of perception at play. Even mundane tasks became part of the web of secrecy. Simple routines like arranging the nursery, preparing meals, or organizing supplies were conducted with an awareness that everything could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or leaked to the outside world. Staff became experts in subtlety, performing their duties while remaining invisible witnesses to a carefully managed reality. The nanny, by virtue of her role, found herself in the unique position of observing the intersection between the official story and the whispered truths behind closed doors. The whispers often included contradictions. Some staff hinted that Archie had been seen briefly, while others insisted he had never been present in the way the public imagined. These conflicting accounts created an air of uncertainty, but to the nanny, they were another piece of the puzzle. She began to recognize a pattern. The more tightly controlled the public narrative, the more cautious and fearful the staff became, and the more hints of a hidden reality surfaced in whispers. The emotional strain on the nanny was significant. She was living in a world where fear and obedience overshadowed transparency. Her instincts told her that she was witnessing something extraordinary, something carefully orchestrated to shape public perception while keeping the truth obscured. And yet, she had to maintain professionalism, fulfilling her duties while quietly documenting inconsistencies, gathering fragments of whispered information, and observing patterns that would later become critical to understanding the larger story. It was during these whispered conversations that she first heard the term managed appearances. One senior staff member explained it indirectly. "Everything here is controlled. Every photo, every smile, every public moment. It's all managed. You'll see. It's how they maintain the image. That statement, delivered in a hushed, almost conspiratorial tone, crystallized the nanny's understanding. The reality she observed inside the palace often differed drastically from the story presented to the public. Staff fear also underscored the extraordinary stakes. They knew that any breach of protocol, any revelation outside the palace walls, could carry serious consequences: dismissal, legal action, or even public vilification. Yet, despite this fear, the fact that these whispers existed at all revealed a quiet acknowledgement among the staff that what the public was being shown was incomplete at best, misleading at worst. The nanny began to correlate the whispered accounts with her own observations. Details about timing, staff movements, and interactions all suggested that the household was functioning less as a traditional family environment and more as a carefully choreographed performance. The whispers confirmed her suspicions. Archie Harrison's early life, as depicted publicly, did not fully reflect the private reality. Staff behavior, cautious and coded, became a crucial source of information. One particular moment stood out. A junior nanny, who had been with the household for just a few weeks, leaned in and said quietly, "I never saw him like you'd expect a baby to be. All I saw were props, appearances, photos, nothing real." The statement was fleeting, almost a whisper swallowed by the bustle of the palace, but it left an indelible mark on the nanny. It confirmed what she had suspected. There was a deliberate manipulation of perception, a gap between what the public saw and what actually occurred behind closed doors. The nanny also observed that the whispers themselves created a network of information. Staff shared small, cautious hints, carefully calibrating what could be communicated and to whom. These whispers were the threads connecting pieces of a story the public was never meant to hear. They were a roadmap for the nanny, providing subtle insights into a household where truth was guarded, reality was curated, and perception was paramount. Over time, she realized that the whispers held more value than any direct observation she could make. They were unfiltered, albeit cautious, expressions of what staff truly believed, saw, or suspected. By listening carefully and connecting these fragments with her own observations, she began to construct a mental model of the palace's inner workings. A picture that revealed deliberate staging, controlled appearances, and the extraordinary lengths the household went to maintain the public narrative about Archie Harrison. By the end of these early weeks, the nanny understood the dual reality of her environment. On one side, the public-facing appearances of joy, motherhood, and a healthy infant. On the other, the private reality of whispered doubts, staged interactions, and a conspicuous absence of everyday infant life. She had become a witness to this dichotomy, gaining insights that no one outside the palace could see. And yet, even with all she had learned, the full scope of what was happening remained hidden. The whispers were only the beginning, fragments of a story that would soon expand into revelations far more shocking than anything she had encountered in her years of childcare. The palace, she realized, was a world where appearances were everything, truth was malleable, and those who observed too closely were forced to navigate the tension between fear and knowledge. Have you ever looked at a photo and believed it reflected reality, only to find out later that what you saw was a carefully constructed illusion? That was exactly the situation the nanny faced as she began observing Archie Harrison's early life. While the world saw charming photographs of Meghan Markle cradling her newborn, perfectly posed in sunlight and smiling for cameras, the reality behind those images was far from spontaneous. The nanny quickly realized that each photo was a meticulously staged production, designed to convey the perfect narrative while hiding inconvenient truths. The first clue came almost immediately. Every image of Archie released to the media was taken at precisely the right moment, with perfect lighting, a flawless backdrop, and carefully positioned staff out of frame. It struck the nanny as unusual. Infants are unpredictable. Babies cry, fidget, and shift, making flawless photo ops almost impossible without some intervention. Yet every photograph she had seen, and every appearance she observed indirectly, seemed unnaturally perfect. The consistency was too precise, the angles too deliberate. Something about it didn't add up. She began paying closer attention to the routines surrounding these photo sessions. Before each public appearance or photo release, The nursery would be prepped meticulously. Toys were arranged, blankets folded, and even lighting adjusted to ensure the perfect shot. Staff moved quietly in the background, making sure everything was in place. The nanny realized that these weren't casual photographs captured in the moment. They were productions designed to convey a narrative. The public saw a smiling Meghan holding a seemingly content infant, but the reality, she suspected, was carefully controlled and rehearsed. It wasn't just the staging that drew her attention, it was the timing. Each photograph coincided with strategic announcements, social media posts, or media coverage. The images appeared exactly when the public was expecting them, reinforcing the narrative that Archie's early days were ordinary and joyful. Behind the scenes, however, the nanny noticed something odd. The baby was often not present in the nursery or only seen briefly. Tasks that should have been routine, like feeding or changing, seemed to be omitted or carefully orchestrated so that no unscripted moments would leak to the public. One particularly telling moment occurred during what she later referred to as the garden photo session. Meghan was presented outside with Archie, posed elegantly with the perfect smile and stylish attire. Staff hovered in the background, whispering directions, moving props, and subtly manipulating the scene to maintain the illusion. The nanny watched as the same poses were repeated multiple times, each retake carefully adjusted for lighting and angle. To the public, it appeared natural, effortless, and authentic. To the nanny, it was a calculated performance, choreographed down to the tiniest detail. Over time, she noticed that certain details were always consistent, almost suspiciously so. The positioning of Archie's arms, the folds of his blanket, the angle at which Meghan held him, they never deviated. There were no messy moments, no signs of the spontaneous unpredictability that normally accompanies infants. It was as if every image had been rehearsed beforehand, with Archie and Meghan performing roles assigned by unseen directors. The nanny began to wonder, if these images were staged, what other aspects of Archie's early life were being orchestrated? The staging extended beyond the photographs themselves. Every public appearance, every brief media moment, was conducted with precision. Staff ensured that the timing, props, and even Meghan's expressions were perfect. She noticed subtle signals, a hand raised to adjust a sleeve, a shift in body position to conceal a blank space, that suggested the images and appearances were manipulated to reinforce a narrative. The public was witnessing only the curated version, the polished performance, while the behind-the-scenes reality remained concealed. She also observed the psychological impact on staff. Everyone knew they were part of a high-stakes production. A single mistake could undermine the narrative, leading to tension, anxiety, and unspoken fear. The nanny realized that she was in an environment where perception was everything and reality was secondary. Staff were trained, intentionally or by culture, to maintain the illusion, ensuring that every photo, every movement, and every public appearance conveyed exactly what Meghan and the household wanted the world to believe. The irony, she noted, was almost cinematic. The world praised Meghan as a devoted, hands-on mother, admiring her composure and apparent intimacy with her baby. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the nanny saw the careful choreography required to maintain that image. It was a performance in every sense, blending aesthetics, timing, and subtle manipulation. The contrast between the narrative and her own observations was stark and increasingly impossible to ignore. Humor and disbelief occasionally broke through her professional detachment. She recalls moments when a staff member would quietly joke about the perfect baby image, a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement that something about the process was theatrical. These whispered comments reinforced her suspicion that appearances were being prioritized over reality, and that every photo op served a purpose far beyond capturing family moments. Over time, the nanny became adept at reading the cues surrounding these staged photo sessions. She could predict when a public appearance would be staged, which props would be used, and how the household would move to maintain the illusion. She realized that what the public interpreted as candid, spontaneous interactions were anything but. The performances were deliberate, orchestrated, and executed with precision to preserve a narrative that may not have reflected the truth of Archie's early life. The deeper she observed, the clearer it became. The staged photo ops were a microcosm of the entire household. They represented the tension between reality and perception, private truth and public narrative. Every pose, every smile, every carefully timed image served as a tool to reinforce an image the household wanted the world to accept unquestioningly. The absence of spontaneity, the meticulous staging, and the careful control of information all pointed to a larger orchestration. Even as she continued her duties, the nanny's awareness of these manipulations grew. She began to question the authenticity of every appearance, the legitimacy of every photograph.